Hi everyone, welcome back to Dark Fantasy Therapy, and today we're gonna talk about the history of the flail, a weapon that was soon forgotten by the world, but that it's still very popular in the video games. I divided the video in 5 phases, and the first one is in the early Middle Ages. Basically, at the very beginning, the flail ancestor, we can say, was not a weapon but a farming implement. It was used across Europe and Asia by the peasants that wanted to thresh the grain to separate the edible kernels from the husk. That was basically consisting of 2 wooden rods connected by a flexible joint. Okay, that was a leather or a rope, not yet a chain. One rod served as the handle, while the other was, swung to strike the bundles of grain. It's funny that at some point this farming tool was started to be implemented as improvised weapon. Okay, because it was basically a threshing flail that, with a little of strength and for the force of the swinging, could be a little harmful. Okay, and could deliver unpredictable blows. And it was available to the rural populations that in some moments they found themselves with no weapons. So in times of the rebellion, these peasants use this agricultural flail as a tool of necessity, okay, to use in the battlefield. The evidence is that this was used in Poland and in the Bohemia, in the Eastern Europe, when there were some revolts, some revolutions of the peasants, and they were using these reinforced flails that they were still kind of the agricultural tools, but they had some adaptation that they were starting to put little addition to make them more deadly. And this is also the origin of the Japanese nunchaku, that it's honestly a weapon that I even learned how to use in my kung fu classes, and it was inspired by that. Now we are among the 19th and the 13th century. He was the early medieval period, and the flail was deliberately adapted into a weapon of war. Okay, they were not just a tool, but they were a weaponized flail. And they were called military flail, to separate, to distinguish them from the agricultural one. And they had still the basic structure of the handle that was still this wooden rod. And then there was this head, not anymore another wood, but it was a head that was striking, linked by a chain or a strap. So they even replaced the leather and the rope. And basically they were reinforced with the metal fittings, okay, and some iron shod heads that, they were designed to penetrate the armor and not anymore just the grain. In Central and Eastern Europe, the flails become a recognizable component of the peasant militias. So they were irregular forces. Okay, they were not the main army, but they were helping a lot their the real soldiers. The records describe the Slavic and the Polish warriors employing this flail against mounted knights because they were using the lever, okay, and the reach. That was very unpredictable with this arc. So basically, they could just swing into the knights, into the horses, and that could be very dangerous. The flexible chain allowed the striking head, to circumvent the shield. Okay, so they were protected behind the shield, but they were still able to catch the opponents off guards, making the flail very, very different from the clubs or from the maces. And during these phases, there were two categories of flails. The one that was the long-shafted flails, that was the one more directly derived from the agricultural look, that were used in mass infantry formation, and they were excellent at breaking through the cavalry charges and so on. And then the short-handled flails, that it was more compact, and this is the one that we still see in very often in video games and so on. The third phase is the high medieval period, so not in the early anymore, but almost at the finish, and there was the knightly flail myth. Basically, it was the high middle age, and this weapon had acquired a peculiar reputation, because in the popular imagination, the most iconic version is still the knightly ball and the chain weapon, as this spiked ball dangling from a short chain attached to this wooden haft and rod. But historians still debate about the specific form that was more used in the history. There are some archaeological evidences for these knightly flails, but they're very, very scarce. There are some examples that survived till now, that there are many museums all around the world, and some of them they were even thought to be ceremonial. Okay, but they can be more around the 19th centuries. And there are some contemporary artwork that depicts these knights wielding the spiked flails, but they are more allegorical than documentary. Nevertheless, the idea of this knightly flail persisted, perhaps because it symbolized raw power and brutality that was different from the sword that was representing more the cavalry, the nobility. The flail was more embodying the chaos, the unpredictability, and the overwhelming strength. In the collective imagination, it became the weapon of the crusaders, the mercenaries, and the brutal enforcers, so more the bad people, we can say. Meanwhile, the long-handled flails continued to be used more reliably in Eastern Europe, in battle against the Teutonic Knights and other armored foes. In the Polish and Lithuanian infantry reportedly deployed this flail in large formation, to attack opponents that were more armored than them. Then, we can say that in this high medieval period, there was an actual reality of the military flails in Eastern Europe, and at the same time there was the myth, the mythology of the knightly flails in the Western Europe. Between the 16th and the 17th century, we witnessed the decline, of this weapon. It was the time where the gunpowder started to replenish all the other weapons in the battlefield, and the traditional melee weapons began to decline. The swords, the pikes, the halberds, they were adapted to something more, ceremonial, as we say, but they were not, widespread in the military field. And, the effectiveness against cavalry diminished because the firearms reduced the dominance of the armored knights. But in the Eastern Europe, the flail persisted a little longer than the West, because there were still the peasant levies in Poland, Hungary, and Ukraine that carried these long-handled flails into combat, because they didn't have access yet to gunpowder, and they were reinforced with agricultural flails, with these iron-bound striking heads. In some way, we witness a little decadiment of the weapon, because it got back to be just an agricultural tool that was often used by peasants into the battle. The Cossacks in particular were known to field these flails in this uprising against the Polish and Russian forces, and he had this democratic character, compared to, as I say, the sword that was more for cavalry and noble people, so the elite armies started to transition to firearms and, different kind of weapons, where the rural fighters continue to rely on familiar, locally available tools. In the last phase, in the 18th century, that are the modern day, the flail it was already part more of the popular imagination rather than the battlefield itself. It disappeared seriously from every battlefield, and the legend grew in the cultural memory. It was more romantic nationalism and antiquarian interest in the Middle Ages, but yeah, I mean, it was not, there was only the myth of the nightly spiked Flail, and some artists, some novelists were, depicting in the books, in the paintings, this historical weapon. But yeah, there is no evidence anymore on any usage into the battle. And during the Victorian era, already many museums started to acquire these so-called medieval flails to show them into their collections. And yeah, it was the end of these very interesting weapons, but luckily it's still very popular into the video games, into the pop cultures. In game like the Dark Souls and the Elden Ring, is still very funny to use. Thank you for following me, and see you very soon.